But tonight we're going to talk about, as I say, mapping logical fallacies. And this was one of the ones that was requested by a member here who comes here, and they're thinking this is something that we really should look into. And I was thinking about it because of this events that I've been watching with Rudy Giuliani and all of his amazing interviews that he keeps doing, and the logic behind those. So essentially when he was on CNN earlier this year, the interviewer Chris Cuomo said, in fact-checking is anything, we've never had anybody with the level of mendacity that Donald Trump has, not even close. Giuliani responds, no, it's in the eye of the beholder. And then Chris Cuomo says, no, facts are not in the eye of the beholder. And Giuliani says, yes, it is. Yes, they are. Nowadays, they are. So facts are in the eye of the beholder. There's no such thing as objective facts. And then later, Giuliani was kind of going off and talking about whether or not they were going to have Trump testify under oath before the prosecutor, and he didn't want to because they did a test of that, and it turns out that he can't talk for just a minute or two without immediately lying. And so then obviously therefore lying under oath, which is a crime, and so they don't want him to testify because he's incapable of not committing a crime while doing it, the crime of lying under oath. And so he says, when you tell me that, Donald Trump should testify because he's going to tell the truth and he shouldn't worry, well, that's so silly because it's somebody's version of the truth, not the truth. To which Chuck Todd said, truth is truth. And then Giuliani insisted, no, it isn't truth. Truth isn't truth. So whether Giuliani here is being Machiavellian, if you were like to think of this maybe philosophically, we've seen or whatever, this not necessarily what Machiavelli believed, but what we have as a caricature of that, which is to say that since might makes right, and the prince, the leader, essentially what's good is what is good for the leader, is the assertion that people have made. And therefore, what some of Giuliani's lawyers have asserted is that if the president does it, that means it's not illegal, it can't be. Or whether it's Orwellian, which is to say using political doublespeak for the purposes of subverting the society, whether it's postmodern, which is to say making a more sophisticated political argument against the very idea of objective reality, or if it's simply noxious. This is an occasion, I think, to reflect on the history of logic in Western thought. And so I want to go back and anyway ask what some of these are. So truth is truth. So one of these things, this is sometimes thought of as like in terms of the Western thought, the bedrock principle or law in terms of classical Western thought, which is the law of identity or principle of identity. Truth is truth. A can't be not A, therefore truth cannot be not truth. So that's essentially the first principle. If your thing is a thing, it is that thing, and it's not the converse of that thing or not that thing. From that, then, we have the principle of non-contradiction. So the proposition A is B, and then A is not B, are mutually exclusive, so they can't both be true. So if A is B, A cannot simultaneously be not B. So fish are vertebrates. Fish cannot simultaneously be not vertebrates, invertebrates. So, and finally then the law or principle of the excluded middle. For any proposition, it is either true or its negation is true. So if A is B is false, then A is not B is true. So essentially if fish are invertebrates is false, then fish are vertebrates is true, right? Is that too many double, triple negatives? Okay. So those are essentially like then those three things upon which it's all built. And so what's the kind of this idea of when it's happening? It essentially traces, as so many things do, back here to Aristotle, who is thought of as being the founder of formal logic in addition to much of Western thought. So one of the things he says in his Metaphysics is the most certain of all basic principles is that contradictory propositions are not true simultaneously. So this principle of non-contradiction. So Aristotle had the goal of trying to systematize thought. So there had been all kinds of arguments ahead of time, and there had been as we've gone through with the pre-Socratics and things like that, and leading all the way up in Socrates and Plato to Aristotle. And in some cases, Aristotle believed, in looking back on some of his predecessors, that they had violated principles like non-contradiction. So in other words, one of the reasons why he feels that that some of these previous thoughts got so out of control, or some of the different propositions that they had, are because there was this contradiction was happening within the thinking. And so he created then a system for testing arguments deductively to determine whether or not they are logically valid. So starting up with premises. If you use those premises, now we look through the system to see if at the end the conclusions drawn from those premises in the argument are valid. So this idea that he had ended up being so amazingly powerful that it really held sway up until the 19th century, at least the 18th and 19th century. And so it's nothing that's even, not only is it dominating all of antiquity, but also, again, all through the Middle Ages in the West. The monks are all, they're doing syllogisms, which is to say they're taking these same kinds of logical premises and everything and doing it exactly the same way that Aristotle was. And in some cases, as we've seen, we did a lecture before on Anselm of Canterbury. In some cases, they're so excited about it that it's almost all kind of crazy logic / dialectic, and it almost loses any coherence to anything that we might be talking about, which is why medieval scholastic theology or Aristotelian theology is sometimes parodied by saying, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. In other words, it's so abstruse that it no longer has any meaning in the kind of real world. Okay, so essentially, for Aristotelian logic, when you're making a proposition, when you're making an argument, it's composed of two terms, and those are the subject and the predicate. And that works kind of like how we use those terms when we're doing grammar for English or something like that when you're a kid. So if we have these two kind of terms, Canadians and philosophers, and we want to think of what's the relationship between those terms, right? So what is the overlap between categories like Canadians and philosophers, right?
It's like a Venn with an E.
It's like
Venn diagram.
Oh yeah, it should be Venn, not Venn. Yeah. Typo. Okay, so here's one of them, the first one of these. So there's four, according to Aristotle. There's only four possible. So one is the universal affirmative, which is to say all Canadians are philosophers. So, Elizabeth isn't sure about this premise. So it's a potentially true premise. Anyway, so essentially when we do this then, the idea here is we take the Canadian circle, and so all of them, since they're all philosophers, they're all inside that predicate circle, right? So in other words, the subject here is all inside the predicate circle. They're all philosophers. And so we blacken out this part over here, to show that there are no Canadians who aren't in the philosopher's circle, because we've universally affirmed that position with this first one. Okay, here's the universal negative. Maybe this one's true. So no Canadians are philosophers. So in this case, there's no overlap at all between the subject and the predicate, right? So we blackened out that overlapping area. There's no Canadians in there because there are none who are philosophers. So in other words, they're over here in this other zone X, all the Canadians, which is outside the circle of philosophers. Okay, number 3, particular affirmative. So some Canadians, and by which that means classically at least one, Canadian, are philosophers. And so, in other words, now we have a circle of philosophers, and we put the predicate, and a circle of Canadians, and there's at least one of them who's inside both of those. There's at least one guy in there, or a woman, and so that's the one or at least one Canadian who is also a philosopher. And then some Canadians are not philosophers. So there might still be somebody in there, in that middle one, but that's not what we're talking about. This statement here, this particular negative, doesn't affirm that. Instead, it's affirming that somebody's out here. At least one of us here is not a philosopher. Okay, and so then taking those four potential options, so essentially those are the affirmative statements, the negative statements, the universal statements, which is to say when we're making a blanket statement, all Canadians, no Canadians, or a particular statement, at least one Canadian, or at least one Canadian in both cases. What Boethius, and we had before a lecture on Boethius. So Boethius is this guy, if you remember, who's at the very end of antiquity, after the fall of the Roman Empire, who is a Christian philosopher who wrote this amazing book, The Consolation of Philosophy. But he wrote that because he's the prime minister of Theodoric the Ostrogoth, who, he falls from power, and he goes from this height of power on wheels fortune to being cast down and ultimately executed for it. And he's trying to essentially understand what's the purpose of life, what's the problem of evil, all those kind of things. Well, one of the other things that he did, while he wasn't busy, running Italy and all the other kinds of things that he was doing, he also translated Aristotle into Latin, and he essentially gave Westerners access to that throughout the entire Middle Ages. And when he did it, he also created this diagram that made it easier for people to understand. So in other words, put these 4 different categories that Aristotle had created and put it into a diagram. And so essentially, you can see here in like a medieval manuscript where we have those 4 categories. You have how they relate to each other. And anyway, this is how, again, medieval monks and nuns were busily learning about logic.
Can you read that stuff?
Yeah. So it says ignis caliditas, which is to say fire is warm, terra sequiturs, aqua frigitatis,
Earth is dry,
air
water is
humiditatis.
cold.
So air, yeah. So water is cold, air is humid. I think he's getting it backwards.
Dry.
I know, but humiditas. Okay, dry, yeah.
Dry, and air is
Terra
humid.
is, that should be. Fire is warm, and what's earth?
Dry.
Dry. Oh, dry. Yeah, siccita. Yeah, like a desert. Yeah, so it's like desiccant, that kind of thing. Okay, and then it goes through and it says, and then it has like up between the top it says contrary, and so those are contraries, and so it lists off those, and we'll get how the diagram works. So anyway, going back to the diagram here as we have it, essentially that if you do this thing, then this is a tool that allows you to understand how these 4 different categories all relate to each other. So if you make a statement, all Canadians are philosophers, then if you go to its diagonal statement from that, some Canadians are not philosophers, that's just contradictory, right? Same thing, if some Canadians are philosophers, then the one that's opposited over there, no Canadians are philosophers, they contradict. And you can also try to see that in the Venn diagrams, because essentially the blackened area is that where the one is where the X is down here. And same thing down here where the X is the blackened area, so they're contradictory to each other. Okay, by contrast, if we go up here among the universal statements, so all Canadians are philosophers, no Canadians are philosophers. These are contrary, so they can't be true at the same time. So it can't be true that if no Canadians are philosophers, that all Canadians are philosophers. But if we do it the opposites, they're opposites of this. So this is where it gets more complicated. So if it's not true that all Canadians are philosophers, so if all Canadians are not philosophers, and the opposite of this one, no Canadians are philosophers, which is to say some Canadians are philosophers, I say it's like, how does it work? So the opposites can be true. And so it's not that all or none of them are, but it's like one of them is, right? So in other words, because you can have a particular number of them be a philosopher, or some of them are, right? But it's not all or none. So those can both be false statements, but they can't both be true, right? And so that's different from the contradictory ones where they're false from each other. Okay, so then the opposite of that is down here, which are reversed. So these are the sub-contrary ones. This technical terms that this is what happens when you have a system for 2,400 years or whatever. You have a lot of technical terms that are associated. So anyway, the sub-contraries. So some Canadians are philosophers, some Canadians are not philosophers. So they both can be true. There's nothing stopping that from having the X in both those two areas. But then they can't both be false at the same time. So if we reverse it again, it's the same exact thing that we did with the contraries. So if we say that this is false, some Canadians are philosophers and some Canadians are not philosophers, the answer has to be that it's all or nothing as opposed to the sum, right? And then we have the other one here, which is subaltern, another one of these particular words anyway. But the idea of this one is that the universal implies the particular. So if all Canadians are philosophers, then it's just true that some are, right? And everybody is. Same thing. If none are, then some are not, right? So anyway, that makes this square. And once you had this was probably, as far as anybody, obviously for over 2,000 years, everybody was like, wow, we really can figure out any kind of how these relationship among these kind of general statements, and you can just plug them into this thing, and once you have that, you're able to determine whether the argument is going to be valid logically or not, right? So, don't even have to know what the terms mean. So, all avians are oviparous. Some avians are not oviparous. So these are one of these is a universal affirmative, so our same Venn diagram, and one of these is a particular negative. And so we stick those into where they go on the chart. All avians are oviparous, some avians are not oviparous, and we can tell they can't both be true. So what does that mean? What is oviparous and oviparous?
It means that all birds are egg-laying.
All birds are egg-laying, or some birds are not egg-laying. And so both of those two things can't be true, right? Because they're on our diagram as opposite each other. So here's another one. No vegan food is delicious. All vegan food is delicious. So as we kind of think about those, automatically those seem like they're not going to work, and they're not. So they're contrary statements. Yes? Did I do it wrong, Ikevanch? Go ahead.
So back to the original, subaltern and subcontrary.
Yeah.
So this is a technical figure.
Yes.
And when I think of it linguistically, so when you say me some Canadians are philosophers, I understand that some Canadians are not.
Yeah.
And which makes this particular affirmative is a subaltern of the particular negative.
Okay.
When you say some Canadians are philosophers, you imply that some Canadians are not philosophers. But here is, in this technical sense, it is, if all Canadians are philosophers, it means some of them are philosophers too, in the logical sense. Am I clear? No.
So you're saying over here, you're saying, tell me which one again. Tell me again. I've got the first one.
Normally in this technical scheme,
Yeah.
the affirmative, universal affirmative on the top
Yeah.
left is subaltern. At the bottom is a subaltern of the universal affirmative.
Okay.
But to my linguistic understanding,
Linguistic,
is
yes.
that actually the negative particular is a subaltern of the affirmative particular, because when you say some Canadians are philosophers, I understand that
Right.
you imply some Canadians are not philosophers.
Right.
And they
But so
include
some.
each other.
So it's a very good point. And so but in this case, that's not what it meant in the technical diagram, because when I said, when I'm defining some here, it means at least one. And so that does not implying, in fact, in this particular diagram, it doesn't imply that the contrary is also the case. In other words, it doesn't imply that some are not. It's at least one. It's not supposed to. That's why it's included in it. So that's how. Because we don't know. This statement is all we're saying is that this statement itself is all by itself true. At least one Canadian is a philosopher. We're not saying whether or not. I'm not Canadian yet. No, so it's not me. It's you. So at least one Canadian is a philosopher. But what we're not trying to say here, we're just trying to get at like a statement that we know, let's say is logically valid. But we are not actually making a claim, an additional claim here that no Canadians, that the rest of the Canadians are not. It's only making the claim that some are, at least one.
Doesn't negate that all Canadians are philosophers. It has not yet been established.
No, I don't say it negates the other one, but I say it affirms the contrary one too. Even if only one Canadian is a philosopher,
Yeah.
that means only at least one Canadian is not philosopher too. This is so it's not about the only one or thing, but there is I think there is a linguistic difference than this technical scheme, but
Okay.
maybe we can discuss later.
Okay, let's also have another comment, because you might have another.
So I think the main point here is that in order to have an argument, you need to have more than one premise. What you're going through now is simply one premise
Right.
in the larger argument. So some Canadians are philosophers would be premise number one. You need a premise number two in order to come to a conclusion, which you haven't gotten to yet.
Right, we haven't gotten to the part where, like you say, we're adding to it. So this is just a premise, and it's not implying what the next one is, like you say. Okay, so we had that one, and then we got to the vegan food one. And this one with vegan food in terms of no vegan food being delicious or all vegan food being delicious, we said it anyways, essentially it's up here with the contraries in terms of these initial premises, which is obviously they can't both be true at the same time, but both could be false because of this all part, all or none part, right? Because in either case there could be some truth that some vegan food, right, is delicious and some isn't, and that would then make these contraries not the case. Both of them are false, right? Okay, and so then we're going to go through, and like you say, get into now how you're going with arguments when we go beyond it. And so if we have something like this, so wine is produced in every province of Canada. Every province that produces wine also has alcoholics. And then the conclusion then is there are alcoholics in every province of Canada. So does that follow?
It does. I'm not sure. I don't think the first premise is true.
This is a very important point. So Elizabeth isn't sure that the first premise here is true, and that's not relevant to whether the logic is valid, right? So what we're looking at here is whether the logic is valid, and so for the logic to be valid, it doesn't matter if the premises are true. What matters is that we start with the premises, and from those premises we get to the conclusion either validly or invalidly. And so, this is, as you guys point out, this is logically valid. Whether it then is sound or not depends on whether the premises are true. So we're not sure. I mean, maybe they are making wine in every province in Canada. I'm not sure about that. I think there probably are alcoholics in every province.
Oh, I'm sure.
but again, in this kind of thing, when we're doing it, we also have to avoid, again, a correlation fallacy. So just because those two things happen to be true, that doesn't necessarily, mean anything. So, for example, this is called cum hoc, ergo propter hoc, which is to say, with this, therefore, because of this. So just because it just might happen. There's all kinds of things that happen in every province of Canada, and it doesn't mean that that's what causes, like each one of those things don't necessarily cause the other thing, right? So correlation fallacy. Okay, so that's one. Okay, here's a major premise. Canada is a constitutional monarchy. Royal assent is required to enact laws. Therefore, the Crown ensures that responsible government is always in place. Well, getting a face from Elizabeth. What does everybody think? Jane thinks that's true. So the argument here isn't invalid, right? Because the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So this is just a non sequitur. right? So it doesn't mean whether or not this is true or not. That's not the point. The question is whether this argument is valid, and the argument is not valid because we're just having a non sequitur. So which does just mean it doesn't follow logically. Okay, all aerobic exercise is unhealthy. Watching TV on the couch is an aerobic exercise. Watching TV on the couch is unhealthy.
That's valid.
That's valid. So, all right. So it's a logically valid argument. The argument is unsound because we can probably assert here that the premises are false. So all aerobic exercise isn't necessarily inherently unhealthy, and same thing, watching TV on the couch is not necessarily an aerobic exercise. However, starting from our invalid hypotheses or premises, we have nevertheless, in making our valid argument, we may have actually come up with a true conclusion, kind of by accident. So watching TV on the couch may well be unhealthy. However, we should then avoid, in getting there, the fallacy, which is to say, just because we have an argument that is false, it doesn't necessarily mean that, and that reaches a particular conclusion, that doesn't necessarily mean the conclusion is false. And so that's another one of our wonderful fallacies. Fallacy. Okay. So we'll just look a little bit at these non sequiturs, because what this formal logic that Aristotle has is how we are able to have some of these. This is one of the ones that I think it's not quite the same as what you're talking about in terms of the linguistic part of it, but this is one where we can have a linguistic issue. So this is called the fallacy of the alternative disjunct. So to be on the cover of Vogue magazine, one must either be a celebrity or very beautiful.
Doesn't say either.
I'm sorry, one must be, it's good that you told me that. I'll go back and rewind. To be on the cover of Vogue magazine, one must be a celebrity or very beautiful. Okay, so this month's cover was a celebrity, therefore the celebrity is not very beautiful. It's not nice to say. Not true at all. She's very beautiful. Okay, so it doesn't follow because the or in the main premise here doesn't apply exclusive categories, right? So there's no particular reason. It doesn't have to be. It's not either. I put the word either in. That made it wrong. I deliberately didn't write that, although then I said it. Anyway, so in other words, you can be therefore a celebrity and beautiful, and that's not. It's not making it. You can't conclude therefore the not beautiful out of it. Okay, masked man fallacy. Lois Lane believes that Superman can fly. Lois Lane does not believe that Clark Kent can fly. Therefore, Superman and Clark Kent are not the same person. What?
No, it's not correct.
we think there's a logical problem here.
Only
somewhere.
if you're Lois Lane.
Only if you're Lois Lane. How does she not get it? So yeah, the idea here is that because so normally this would be the law of non-contradiction. If Superman can fly and Clark can't fly, then we would have this A equals B, A equals dot B issue where it'd be contradiction. But because it's relying on Lois's beliefs, it becomes, anyway, a fallacy. Kvanch. Yeah. Epistemological
Processing
fallacy.
a little bit slow, just the previous one.
Okay.
Again. So to detect the fallacies actually is not very straightforward.
Yeah.
I think I've detected another one here.
Yeah.
Because the first premise, the second premise is included in the first premise, and which makes the plus sign invalid.
Okay.
So actually, this is not these. In order to deduce the conclusion, you have to have these the general form two premises.
Yes.
But actually, this month's cover was the celebrity is not a new information because it's already included in the first premise.
No, it's not.
Because it must be a celebrity. The cover. If this month is if
So
there
in
is
other
a
words,
cover.
because this is always so you're saying that that's just begging the question, because which is to say you are having we already had that information in the first one because all of the months are that way.
Yeah.
And so this is just it's not actually an additional.
Yeah.
So it's another fallacy on top of it. It's also
Yeah.
essentially begging the question, which is to say you reusing the having your thing in the same, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Valerie.
Well, I've seen people on the cover of Vogue magazine who were neither celebrities nor beautiful.
Uh-oh.
So,
So you're also
So there's
challenging our
yeah,
major premise.
yeah, not to be elided.
So again, in that same way, though, whether or not the major premise is true does affect whether then the argument is sound at the end, but it doesn't affect whether the logic is valid, right? So that's the main point with all those. So that was same here too. Okay, another one, another non sequitur, this base rate fallacy. So if there's a device that they've had, this new miracle device that they've now installed in all the in all the airports in the United States, the scanner successfully identifies 99% of the terrorists who are scanned, and then it sets off an alarm. So 99 out of 100 terrorists who walk through, the alarm goes off. The scanner also sets off the alarm 1% of the time when it scans someone who is not a terrorist. Conclusion, therefore, half the time the alarm rings, the person's a terrorist, and so you can just go after him, right?
It's all bullshit, but aside from that,
Yeah.
it makes sense.
Well, so it does, and sometimes if people don't think of this, right? But it's because of this idea is that they've forgotten here the base rate, right? And so the idea in this particular one is the terrorist population in proportion to the base population is really, really minuscule. And so the fact is it might be more than a factor of 100 here, maybe a factor of 10,000 or something like that. And so therefore the number of times that it would actually be catching a terrorist, if such a thing could exist, which can't, it would be not half the time, you know what I mean? Because we're missing a term here. Does that make sense? Okay. Begging question. So these are kind of things like we have we get this all the time, which where we say Machiavelli is the first man in the modern era to do this or that, but by just putting it into creating a periodization that is arbitrary and sticking it right in front of him, and then he's the first one to do it in that era, is an arbitrary periodization. But essentially here the thing is already implied in the conclusion. So if Australia has the smallest total area of any continent, therefore Australia is the smallest continent, it's simply restating the question. I mean, there's nothing new in the information here. So the argument may well be valid, but it isn't telling you anything.
And you need to have at least two premises for an argument.
Yeah, and there needs to be another premise for an argument. Elizabeth.
Thank you for using the term begging the question. I think it was correct, because most of the time when people say begging, that begs the question, what they mean is that raises the question.
Oh.
Which is quite different.
Okay.
And it drives me crazy.
Lost cause.
Petitio principii, begging the question, begging the first issue. So puts forward then an argument whose validity requires on its own conclusion, and like you say, in this case is also we don't have any more premises, it's just restating it. Okay. So anyway, in terms of these kind of things with logical fallacies, and it's where we've been dealing with essentially deductive logic or deductive reasoning. And so deduction here is the process of reasoning from two, I guess, statements is what it should say, premises that leads to a logical conclusion that though is therefore certain in terms of the logic of it, not whether or not it's true, but whether or not it's logically valid. And so although Sherlock Holmes often talks about deduction, or says what do you deduce from these particular clues, he is almost always not using deduction. He's almost always using induction or abduction, which is to say using limited evidence to determine the most likely scenario, as opposed to working from premises and coming out with a logical conclusion that is valid or invalid. So anyway, this is generally speaking not what he always says. Anyway, what do you deduce?
What is abduction?
It's so, what subduction is. So these are all, so duct in Latin is all, it means lead, like educate and those kind of things. And so deduction is lead from, induction is lead in, abduction is out. Yeah, lead out. So anyway, we'll go through kind of charts of these kind of different ones. So essentially for deduction, as we've kind of been seeing here, we can be sure with this thing based on our little square that we and the monks know, is that whether the argument is valid or not. And so logically invalid arguments are false and can be dismissed, the argument part of it. So, but it's only sound, as we saw, if the premises are true, and we had a lot of false premises in all of our different logic, and that can lead to that. And so a valid argument then can be built on false premises and that is therefore valid but unsound. And then, of course, you can have an invalid and unsound argument. So false premises that also have an invalid, logically invalid argument. But as we saw also, just because your argument is propping up that, it doesn't necessarily say anything about the conclusion. It just says it's about your argument. So Aristotelian logic then allows us to dismiss logically invalid arguments. But when we have this kind of certainty, it can be very expensive in the sense that we aren't actually learning anything new from this deduction, right? So essentially all the things that are, all the truth that we have is in the premises, and we're just seeing whether, from building that, if we're getting logically valid results from it, and not deducing or deducing. Anyway, it doesn't come up with anything new information that's not already in our premises. Even if you can build a big whole tower of scaffolding of argument. So if we start with false premises, also a logically valid argument is still unsound, right? So let's go from inductive here. So these are arguments based on probable evidence that yield results that are likely or unlikely, but they're not certain, right? And so lots of this is what we do in modern times, and this is how we replace this, right? So in science, and this is a thing that people have trouble with, whenever we're dealing with anything. So in the past, we got to say when we were building like this, people would say, okay, well, this is now the law of gravity. Although they were actually using these kind of things by the time they got to gravity. And so this is why we now use words like theory of evolution, and then people imagine that anybody's theory is just as good as any other theory, because they're not aware of essentially, how it's all built up and how much evidence is based on the particular theory. And so this is something that we have in history as well, which is that we largely aren't saying that we prove this or that absolutely did happen or this or that didn't happen, but rather, this is why we always, every scholars almost always use what sometimes people think of are Weasley words, but essentially means the most likely scenario or the likely thing happened, or this is the most probable result of what happened, right? So essentially, this is based not on whether the logic is valid or invalid, but rather your argument here is either strong because it has a higher probability based on the evidence, or it's weak because as you look at all the evidence, the probability isn't actually very likely. And then from the strong, then, it's cogent, then, if it's probable based on the evidence, and we started with these true premises again, and then probable evidence drawn from false premises may well be a real strong argument, or it sounds strong, but it is based anyway, like I say, on a false premise to begin with, and then of course you can always have weak and uncogent arguments too, that are the likely one. It's a weak argument, and it also has a false premise. So some of these kind of ones that are and we can't even do all of them. This has been anyway. I went through and I kind of just picked out favorite logical fallacies that are kind of over into this land, because there are a lot. So one of them, are these different kinds of appeals, red herrings. So there's all kinds of different appeals that you can make, and they can be to almost anything. But one of the favorite ones for a whole long time is appeal to authority. And so if we take, for example, Aristotle said that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. And since Aristotle is pretty much the greatest natural philosopher of all times, we can therefore conclude that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. In other words, because we've appealed to his authority and he says so, and so that's as much as we have. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Actually, there are two separate ones. So the red herring fallacy is a separate fallacy.
Okay.
And it's throwing in like a red herring. So if they're arguing like Aristotle said that heavier objects fall faster, Aristotle was pretty much the greatest natural philosopher of all. and red herrings have red feathers, therefore.
Oh, okay.
The red herring is actually the red herring fallacy.
Okay. I guess I heard that this one was a category that of which the red herring fallacy is one of the main ones, but maybe I'm reading it wrong. Yeah. Okay. So we'll call this one just appeal to authority, and there's all kinds of other appeals that you can make. So that you can say appeal to, religion, or appeal to custom, appeal to history. This is the way we've always done it. Appeals to tradition. Yeah, this is appeals to poverty. I'm so poor, you should help me out, or whatever it would be. Anything that you would make an appeal to. So anyway, experts. This doesn't mean that everything Aristotle says is wrong just because he's an authority, but it means that what it means is that Aristotle has to prove his points just like anybody else. Another one here is false dilemma. So you start with a premise like either you love me or you hate me, and you clearly don't love me. So therefore, you must hate me, right? And so this doesn't follow because obviously there's a lot of other potential here. But we use this one. This happens all the time. If we don't respond, right now we've drawn, to the red line or whatever, then people won't, will say that we're a weak country or something like that, and then we don't, whatever. So it's an urging that we have. That's a false dilemma. That when there may well be any number of other kinds of options on the table. Okay, this is another one, a faulty generalization, the no true Scotsman one. So first guy says, no Scotsman wears no Scotsman wears anything under his kilt. The second one says, well, Ewan McGregor is a Scotsman and he wore boxers under his kilt. And then the person comes back. This isn't a block premise. I probably shouldn't have the plus here. But anyway, the person comes back anyway, and having had that response, he says, no true Scotsman, wears anything under his kilt. And so essentially, when we had this thing with the no Scotsman, this is one of our universal statements. And one of the things that we make about those kind of universal statements, they can, they're really powerful. We want to have a universal truth or a universal thing that we can say. But they also break down with any counterexample that you have. So if anybody can assert a counterexample, the black swans. So any number of things, if all swans are white, but I got a black one. So anyways, they're not all white anymore, right? And so anyway, once you have that, but then one of the, so this would be one way that you try to do it. You try to fix it and say, well, no, true Scotsmen still have the thing that I want, right? As opposed to your example. So they made a different category. It's not that different from moving the goalpost fallacy too, where you have, you've set something up, the person gets the qualities, and then you change the goalposts in order to keep winning the argument. That's the one your dad does? This one's my favorite one as a historian. And so, this is in this big category of questionable causes, and this one, post hoc ergo propter hoc. So Donald Trump, and we just mentioned this one. So Donald Trump entered office January 2017. The U.S. economy added 4 million jobs in 2017. Therefore, Donald Trump created 4 million new jobs. That makes sense. That's what Donald Trump says all the time. So, okay, but just because something happened before something else, it doesn't mean obviously that the earlier event caused the later event. This is just sequence of events. So we'd have to prove something else that made the cause. In other words, how he did it to make the cause.
But as I understand it, David Hume says a similar thing. What is the cause and what is the relation between the cause and what's it called? Effect.
Cause and effect. Yeah.
Effect. If you look from a postmodern perspective, it's impossible to have a correct logic that wouldn't include a questionable cause. Even if the sun, any effect that you explain by a cause is not certain. Every cause is somehow questionable if you look at it from a ground perspective. But I understand this, of course.
I see what you're saying. And so, in fact, actually, we started this way back at the beginning with the possibility that Rudy Giuliani is actually asserting some kind of postmodern philosophical idea, and he and it's possible. I don't know. And so because this is kind of where we're at, and so in fact, like you say, what we're doing here now in going back and looking at these are in some sense based on traditional logic and things like that. But there are, like you say, big challenges, or people are arguing in postmodernism against logic itself and all of these kind of things and premises and cause and effect, right?
Well, any inductive inference actually is,
Okay.
well, seemingly falls into this category.
Yeah.
By definition. Yeah,
So our
some are stronger, some are
Would you
weaker,
say,
I
I mean,
understand.
as
but-
such, how do postmodernists do history?
Oh, do they?
I don't know. I'm just asking as a. So Valerie maybe knows. So.
Well, history is, I don't know whether you agree as a historian, but is very, very reliant, not exclusively reliant, but very reliant on interpretation of evidence from the past.
Mhm.
Everything from text to archaeological evidence to, the whole body of history as accumulated and relied upon as a form of authority. But in any case, interpretation is a very important aspect of it. And postmodernism very much critiques various forms of interpretation on the basis that they are subjective ultimately. And so interpretation itself is held into question as to its validity.
Mhm.
In other words, we can't have a great deal of certainty around interpretation. And so because it's so interpretation reliant, history to postmoderns is something that that is not within the provable realm of truth.
Yeah, but in that sense, I mean, like I was suggesting, that it's not about where history is at is not about let's say 100% proof or anything like that, but rather it is a system whereby we're asserting what the most likely scenario is based on, let's say, reading the different evidence, understanding the sources, and all this kind of thing.
For postmoderns, there's very much a consciousness of. Sorry, there's very just if I may add, for
Yeah.
postmoderns, there's very much an awareness, and this goes back to the whole what's called the hermeneutic of suspicion,
Yeah.
that we all are framed and formed in our ability to interpret by our social circumstances, such things as race and social class and gender and whatnot, and so we all look to a certain extent through a glass darkly, and so
Yeah.
there's no way to ultimately dissect that. We're all of us, coming from a certain perspective.
Yeah.
So this kind of perspectivitism is very, very important in postmodernism, and so.
So my question is just though that, I mean, because I don't disagree that we have all of these factors, in terms of all the different things that cause me to think of. I mean, one of the reasons why we keep on getting back to Western stuff is because that's my background and I understand it, right? And I don't do very well. I'm not as aware. There's all kinds of wonderful, let's say, systems of logic that are from ancient China. And I looked at it and I thought, there's just no way I can include this because I just barely get the Western stuff, is my view anyway. So my point of it, though, therefore, is that from all of those kind of biases, circumstances where I am as all the different things that, all the different categories and everything that I have are, how is there a difference between a spectrum of that I'm acknowledging, let's say, that there inevitably everything that's going to come up with out of the history we might write is going to have flaws, but and yet, in other words, all models maybe are going to are not going to be reality. They're going to approximate reality, and you'll just be doing it though better or worse depending on all the different other factors, right? So is it just that it's no point in the exercise at all, or because it's always just nonsense?
Well, I think postmodernism has put a very heavy emphasis on making sure that we're very aware that that each of us has a individual subjective approach to the truth that's, so to speak, slanted.
Yeah.
And just to be aware of that, the possibility of that slant, even though according to that theory, we can't see the slant. It's like water to the fish. The fish can't see the water because they're immersed in it, and so just they put a really big emphasis on that.
Okay, got it.
I don't know anything about postmodernism, but
Okay.
in philosophy, in logic, I think you said it before, that inductive reasoning, through inductive reasoning, you really don't make 100% conclusions. You say something like, with this evidence, it is likely that this caused this. You don't say that this caused this necessarily. Also, what was I going to say? In philosophy, there's a common understanding between philosophers that you're charitable with the arguments that are presented before you. So if you see an argument that doesn't make sense, your first job as a philosopher are to suggest premises that will make the argument true, which will make the conclusion true. So it's not just to shoot down an argument. You're supposed to try and be charitable and provide additional premises that would make that true.
I like that.
And I think that's how philosophy progresses. So if something 20 years down the road doesn't make sense, then offer premises that will then make that true.
I like that as a, a cultural idea among philosophers in order to, to make the discipline progress and be nicer. I was just doing that. I was at a history conference this last weekend, and it was actually a church history conference, and I was teaching basically to amateurs, who are amateur church historians in their different congregations, what are some basics of how to do history. And so one of them was sort of a suggestion of don't just sit around and debunk everything, because that could be the kind of way that history is done too, where everybody, let's say, they have a particular story that is nicely held in their particular church and things like that, and that may be part of the congregation's identity and sacred story and things like that, and then you go in and say, well, that didn't actually happen, so you just busily debunk that, Anyway, so it would be, instead of that, maybe, again, how can you, without saying that something that didn't happen happened, of course, how can you say that why this story came to be told and why it has been important to the life of the congregation or identity and that kind of thing. Okay, post ergo propter hoc, and whether or not the basis is being challenged, but anyway, this is still where I'm at. So, and then another last one here then is another one of my favorite ones is slippery slope. And so I was preaching early this spring. I went to the most conservative congregation of my denomination down in rural Ohio, and they had this incredible preaching chart from our denomination from back in the 1910s on the wall. And the preaching chart is showing how you essentially can start from birth and go essentially either follow the narrow way that's going to take you all the way to heaven, or you can follow this broad way that is definitely not leading just leading to the pit or whatever. And so zooming in on the broad way, how you get there, there's a very slippery slope. So it starts with lying and deception. It goes to card playing, and it's just one of these leads right to the next. From card playing, it goes straight to dancing, which leads to revelry, which leads to murder. The pit. So anyway, this is an example of sliding down anyway into the pit. And so another one is obviously if we're only now, as we knew from way back when they had marriage equality in Canada, it was predicted within a decade, then we would all be marrying our pets. And so we're only a year or two off
Aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. So we're only a year or two off of that from that in the slippery slope.
Wonderful.
So.
How old is that?
Oh, this is from it's about a century old. Yeah, this used to be. We have one of these, so because we retain the history and things like that. So this was the main way that essentially the preachers would go around and they would teach. And anyway, what people needed to do. Shaheen.
That last one, right around the pit of prison,
Uh-huh.
where you see people going up, it's almost like in Star Trek, where it's like beaming.
They're getting beamed up there. Let's see. So the rest. So yeah, this is essentially the resurrection, I think, but they're still going to go into judgment. So they're getting beamed up here to the resurrection. Maybe they're going to make it. I don't know. I have to look at it. Anyway, yeah, no, they're getting up here for the millennium and then final judgment, and they're going to make it back, I think. So anyway. All right, so that's logical fallacies. Bogdan.
Where does statistics Where do statistics and probabilities and there's something called Bayesian logic. Where does that all fit into this?
So into abduction. so I really ran out of time in terms of like putting all the different things into it. But it's again, as we have now gotten past, I just wanted to go back to some very big basics, and we went all the way back and looked at this thing. But essentially now there are new types of formal logic. And these are like, so we started with deduction and then induction and then abduction. And so this idea is that, like you say, as we have, we're adding to the probabilities. Before we were talking about induction, where we are using likely arguments and more and less likely arguments, and for stronger or weaker arguments. And now in addition to that are statistical probabilities that is allowing us to kind of rate, and quantify some of these arguments and whether they're stronger or not.
There's also something called fuzzy logic.
Fuzzy logic. Here's some. That's just a comment that's going to stand alone. Do you want to describe fuzzy logic, or are you saying that's just another logical fallacy?
No, it's a legitimate field of logic.
Logic.
Oh, yeah,
Here, go ahead.
it's something people talk about. I have no idea what it is. Do you know what it is?
Do I know? I can't.
Okay. Do you want to talk about fuzzy logic, Ivan, or do you want to talk about something else?
Fuzzy logic simply refers to the truth value not being 1 and the untruth value not being 0, but something in between. So basically, when I say if the glass is full or empty, then with fuzzy logic you have it's not probabilistic, because the glass is certainly half full. And how are you going to express this truth? So in general, whether it is true or not, you cannot say the glass is full or empty, but then you can certainly say the glass is half full. So, and then if the glass is half full, then you can have other premises included, and then you can have basic inference tools to make the necessary inferences. But probably it is not the subject of logical fallacies, because those logical fallacies is, as I understand, what to make of from something that is either irrelevant or false, how to make the conclusion. So I was thinking about the different kind of logics as well when you were presenting this compact, nice presentation. So one thing that struck me, I'm not directly going into the subject, but one thing that struck me is that the logic actually, which I knew, but you reminded me very strongly that these logics include, doesn't include the opposite in general. So the contradictions are eliminated. So when you ask me how did these postmodernism write history, I don't know much about postmodernism, but what I know is that, for instance, historical materialism, that the contradictions, inherent contradictions, are a method to ask the questions why things unfold, why things should have unfolded this way. I mean, this is just another kind of methodology that includes the contradictories as a way of making making inferences and come to conclusions.
Yeah.
But not doing this analysis, not excluding the contradictories. So this is what came to my mind.
Well, you want to have a comment, Angelina? Valerie.
Yeah, I should mention another area of philosophy that contributed a very good deal to questioning and revisioning traditional logical systems, and that's the starting in the late 19th century and then through the 20th century, school of analytic philosophy, which put an emphasis on the analysis of the very use of words and terms. And something that remained unexamined in traditional logic was an assumption that we know what words mean very well,
Right.
and they deepened the analysis of words. And one of the let's say views or findings is that our very language is systematic, that there are links among all the terms we use and concepts that we use that form in some ways a closed circle, and that it's very difficult to separate any one aspect of this linguistic or hermeneutic circle.
Yeah.
Without you can't escape this linguistic system, and this work was done not only by analytics but as well by certain French philosophers and anthropologists like Saussure and de Saussure, et cetera, which led to the study of semiotics and on the continent. And so, we kind of loosely use terms. Let's say, I think a very obvious one would be something like the ether. That used to be common coin in science. It was an assumption.
Right.
And now, we dissolved that, and that's a little bit easy. But then when it comes to terms like God, let's say,
Right.
we still use that many people use that as common coin.
Yeah.
Not that common, of course, but that's something that needs to be done too in logic, is to take a close look at the very words that we use to form, premises and conclusions and whatnot. So,
And I mean, that's actually a really good comment to also make when we do rewind all the way back to the ancient Greeks, is that they are really, really serious about words, and they are susceptible to really thinking that the word itself is, is an idea that is, that is transcending the word, right? Or the word, so in other words, the power of words was for ancient people, was already so elevated. And especially because they are also less aware of things like linguistic history, the whole change of how words change etymologically, all the kinds of things that we're very aware of words. So the words, not having anywhere near the same meaning as when let's say we first got a hold of any of these things. And so anyway, so it's something that it's a good check to have on on ourselves when we go back and are looking, because it really right down to when we were doing this basic foundations of thought, and we have these laws or principles or whatever that Aristotle has, they almost rely on essentially, it's word equals not word. And so therefore there's a real emphasis on words as categories and as having essential meaning, as opposed to, like you say.
And an important additional issue with regards to that is how well do words and concepts represent very reality itself? How much can our concepts and language reach very reality itself? So that's a huge issue in epistemology.
Yeah.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for putting on the talk.
Yeah.
Great to get everyone together. I have a question about interest of young people today. Like you're talking about back in the past, when people were thinking logically, like you were saying about this great wave that came through, and everyone was like, okay, this is logic.
Yeah.
How far away, is it much, it's, now maybe, again, this is just sort of throwing off the top of my head, but it seems that today people don't seem like they care about logic at all, or just maybe they're bombarded, or their brain is whatever it is.
Yeah.
Is there a big difference between the intention of people to find logic at a certain period in time compared to now?
Well, when I said everybody got really excited, there weren't that many people in ancient Greece that heard what Aristotle said and got really excited. We think of it as everybody because the only people that we have access to in history are people who wrote stuff down, and which is a very tiny percentage of the population. So at a certain point, it's essentially the thinkers, the writers, and that kind of a thing in antiquity. More recently, in the last couple hundred years, anyway, in the early modern period, as the number of people who were literate and increased, logic was, I think, well, logic was really exciting in the Middle Ages again, but anyway, but it's still a major part of the curriculum, and there's only a little bit of it left, I think, as far as I'm aware anyway, in terms of when I was a kid, we were still being taught in junior high essentially Greek logic when we were taught geometry. So essentially in 10th grade I had introduction to plane and solid geometry, and it included logical proofs where you would take a premise about, let's say, geometric forms, and then you would use that in order to, and use different principles like reflexive principles and things like that in order to make essentially mathematical proofs. And so logic like that obviously has continued to be taught to some extent in a particular kind of mathematics, but I feel like it's not all that taught, certainly in terms of on Facebook yelling at each other. And so that's one of the reasons why, even though the complexity surrounding a lot of modern philosophy and a lot of the places where we are, just even having a basic grounding in where we were seems like it is important to just kind of start from that, and then from there, if we want to all study some of these more recent challenges to this, we at least will be grounded in where it's come from. So I'd say we're in a place where maybe we were much more worried about it a century ago than we maybe are now in terms of the general population. But before that, the percentage of the population that's educated is so tiny that it would just be a very tiny part of the population any time before. Angelina?
I just want to speak to the last question, and
yes.
I think the answer to that question is, of course, it depends. And I feel like very strongly compelled to come to the rescue of young people, in a certain way.
Yes.
And just because they are taught logic differently and that they apply logic differently doesn't mean that they are less literate in that area.
Okay.
They may not know it, but they are the digital natives. They are the ones who are, coding and programming at early teenage, and you cannot do that without logic. So they apply logic, and they swim in different kind of water to
that's a good.
Valerie. And in terms of bringing it to postmodernism, we really cannot relate and cannot, from outside look in. But I have been exposed to youth from very diverse cultures, and it's amazing how, despite the, education being what it is, so I'm not going to go on a rant in that area, the kids and the young people are really fabulous, and they are making up, and they are way better, and they are way more competent that it's often believed of them. So I was getting to be like an old person and starting to say, doing my old-timey, which I'm getting to be an old person. Anyway, doing my old-timey, well, back in my day, we learned this thing. But you make a very good point that, for example, let's say, being taught, maybe it doesn't have to be taught geometry and plain and solid proof and things like that. If you are being taught computer programming, obviously the computers are responding to logic. They're working in that language. And so that would be another way that you're accessing it very, very much so in a real practical way. They are already living in a different world than us.
Yeah.
And will be living in a world that we have no access to. So logic is traveling really well with the new generation.
Good point.
If I may add one thing. Maybe it's a little bit controversial, it might be a controversial opinion, but I think what I see, especially in the new generation too, the overuse of logic. What I mean is that I think a famous English poet, I don't quite remember, Keats, it might be Keats, defined a notion that, which I also forget, but the capacity to remain in a suspended, suspicious, or not suspicious, but
suspended disbelief.
To postpone, to be able to capacity to be able to postpone the decision.
Okay.
And when you have these logical schemes in front of you every time, that you have the premises flying around and then come to conclusions immediately. Because it is just like a way that brings you to conclusions. And it is so irresistible, I mean, to come to the conclusions at once. And, maybe a little bit of a more fuzzy logic is might be needed for the younger generation, as I see. I'm a little bit in interaction with the young generation. So one thing I saw different. I've been to a philosophy conference recently, and the thing is that logic was one part of the important topics. Medieval logic in medieval philosophy, actually.
Yeah.
And there, what I see, the philosophers themselves, they avoid coming to conclusions, which is, I think it's the right academic way of doing things. But they somehow start from the premises. But if the premises are correct, then this is correct, and then some other person offers some other set of premises, and if this is, and without falling to fallacies. But also not coming to conclusions, because acknowledging that those premises are only premises, whether they are, however they are strongly likely.
Right. Right. So at the end of especially withholding whether or not we think that the conclusion is sound or not, because we still have to go back and re-examine the premises. So I think that because the audience microphone is going, that's why it's making all this noise. The batteries are going on it, I think. So I think we're going to conclude the formal part, and we'll take this offline, and we'll thank everybody for joining us. And remember that we're having a 2-week hiatus. So you come back and join us in 3 weeks when we're going to do Christian militancy, so which will be a little bit more, we'll know a little bit more about.